So how are you doing today, John?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, welcome to the TPA Full Disclosure series. So to kick off our interview with you, I noticed that you began your career with the Institution of Civil Engineers, and now you push for transparency in the construction sector. So why transparency in the construction sector? Why is it important? Why should people care about construction transparency?
Um, I mean, there's several things. Um, we're very much one of the things you have to understand is that construction really is just an activity within a much longer value chain, a much longer infrastructure project cycle. So at cost, we're really looking at the full infrastructure project cycle, looking at from project identification right through the design, preparation, and construction phases. Because through this kind of long value chain, there are various pinch points. There's numerous pinch points where things might happen, where there can be inefficiencies, mismanagement, and corruption. And infrastructure is really so essential to life, to our way of life. It's absolutely essential. If you look at the social development goals, it's absolutely essential to delivering things like clean water and sanitation and renewable energy supplies. It's absolutely essential to mitigating the effects of the climate crisis. We were involved in an OECD event last week we organised, and there was a fascinating insight about India about how they're only going to reach peak carbon emissions in the next 10 years, and then to drop to net zero requires really an investment and a change in infrastructure the likes the world has almost never seen before. So infrastructure and the way we invest, deliver, and manage infrastructure is absolutely crucial to really the type of economy, society that we're going to be living in for the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years.
So
and then I think really why transparency. So just to add to that, really transparency and accountability then is absolutely critical to this, because we pay for this. We pay for it through as citizens, as taxpayers. It says our taxes that really are building the roads, building those hospitals that we've never relied on so much, the clean water that we drink, the electricity that we get from switching on our lights, the Wi-Fi that we all so reliant on now to be able to talk like this. And we need to know how much money is being spent. I'm really opening up to that transparency, participation, accountability is absolutely critical to opening up that investment so that we all stakeholders, all citizens, but also governments, the private sector, have access to the same information at the same time and really reap the benefits of that investment.
Great. John, let me take you back a little bit, just for the sake of perhaps people who are not working in the TPA field. How will you explain to a layman what construction transparency is? What does it entail?
So what does it mean? So what we're doing at cost is really transparency is about opening up each phase of an infrastructure project to public scrutiny, so that you as a citizen can go on your mobile phone like we do in Ukraine and you go in Honduras and Thailand, and you can look on a website and you can see information about how long the road is, where it's being built, who the beneficiaries are, who the contractor is, the environmental and social impacts are. And you're able to track that project through what can be many, many years. And that you have that data, you can track it, you can use it and make some sense of it, and then hold government and those accountable for those projects to account. And we're really finding that that evidence really can drive change. We have examples of where, by training journalists to use the information, by training local communities to use that information, we have seen how governments do respond positively. We can build consensus and trust through participation, through openness, that has led to significant changes. So we have seen, for example, on numerous projects, things like that information leading to defective bridges in Ukraine being repaired. We've seen speed bumps introduced in Kampala that has led to, a reduction in the number of accidents on that particular road. And then much broader sector reforms. We've seen corrupt roads unit in Honduras closed, and we've seen kind of important changes in terms of the way environmental and social impacts are being managed in the port sector in Honduras. And then money being saved in Afghanistan because the evidence that transparency is given has allowed kind of much more capacity and focus around how vital transport infrastructure is designed.
Okay. So you double as the program director of cost and at Engineers Against Poverty. So what is the intersection between these roles? What is the difference between what you do at cost and what Engineers Against Poverty, what's it all about?
So Engineers Against Poverty is a UK registered charity that for just over 20 years has been looking at the interface of engineering, infrastructure and development. It's been from a kind of policy and practice point of view, developing, kind of looking at through using research and policy and practice. And one of our our strategy is very much focused on three intersections, really around governance, infrastructure governance, which really cost fits into very much around transparency, accountability and participation, and social equity, and really by which we mean how do the poor benefit from that investment. I started getting involved in this 15 years ago, this kind of area. And really at that time we were looking, when I first really started working at the Institution of Civil Engineers on this topic with EAP, and really looking to understand, well, at that time, how does infrastructure procurement and the social opportunities that there may be, how can we start maximizing those with a thought to how does that contribute to the Millennium Development Goals? And all these conversations I kept having came back to corruption and, and the lack of transparency and opaqueness that was in the system. So, and it was at that time there was a big report into corruption in the sector by Transparency International. So there was a kind of a, symbiotic kind of convergence. So EAP has been involved since the pilot, which DFID, what was then DFID, commissioned in 2008. And then we were asked to manage cost on behalf, when cost was set up as an independent UK charity in 2012, to manage the program, which we have done to this day. So yes, a large part of my role is to manage cost on behalf of the trustees there, but also on behalf of the members of cost. Cost is a membership body made up with, at the moment, 20 members, governments and their civil society and private sector partners from around the world, covering particularly all four corners of the world.
Okay, so what, in essence, what impact does the work that you do, how does it impact the infrastructure sector, especially in combating corruption and creating a transparent business environment?
So really, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's three areas where we have impact, really by opening up infrastructure to public scrutiny. One is those kind of individual infrastructure projects, whether it's a road, a water facility, a hospital, and really providing evidence independent through the data that's made public, but also what we call an assurance process, where independent experts turn the data that's made public into compelling information, highlighting evidence and really outlining some recommendations. And what we find is that governments use that, and the kind of the interchange with the pressure from civil society and media, who we build their capacity, a multi-stakeholder approach with government, civil society and the private sector sitting around the same table, not dissimilar to the kind of EITI multi-stakeholder approach, allows government to use that evidence and make those changes. So we're just learning at the moment about how evidence from a report in Malawi is leading to additional funding and some design improvements to a cancer hospital, a $10 million cancer hospital. Secondly, a similar approach to those kind of issues that are highlighted in insurance reports, but also with community meetings, things like that, they lead to broader sector reforms. So longer term impacts. So if you're introducing improvements to environmental and social considerations in the impact assessment, the way projects are designed and prepared. So those kind of much longer term impacts to make sure we're the system of delivering infrastructure across a ministry is much more efficient and effective. And we're delivering those vital services to citizens and to businesses. As I said earlier, we've got several examples of that, which are interesting. For example, quite interesting now, a whole new unit is being set up in the Ministry of Finance in Honduras, devoted to PPPs, which is based on the evidence that Costa has generated. So hopefully they'll be delivering better, big infrastructure projects for those citizens in the long term. And then thirdly, and this is something quite new and quite interesting, we think, over the last 18 months we've been learning about, is I think all of us in the transparency and accountability community have always thought that we've always presumed, it's based on our theory, that greater transparency will be a deterrent effect, has a deterrent effect, without necessarily being able to prove it or understand it. So we understand that the Ministry of Finance in Thailand has been reporting now for some time significant cost savings, currently totaling $460 million, because of that effect of the deterrent effect. So what they're saying is that the deterrent effect is changing the behavior of the private sector. Firms are entering in lower bid prices on dozens of infrastructure projects. And that so far has led to this considerable saving. We've also seen in Uganda some tentative changes in the way that more firms are bidding for contracts because of certain changes we've been able to help with the public procurement office there. So we're beginning to see behavioural changes in the marketplace because of opening up system.
That's good. So let's bring it down to the current moment we have now, which is this COVID era. So how has the pandemic, how has it impacted the push for transparency in the construction sector in general? And what have TPA practitioners, not cost this time around, but practitioners working in construction transparency, what are they doing to mitigate these challenges?
It's a good question. I mean, one of the things I think one of the critical things is there's often been overlooked in COVID is the enormous investment in emergency health facilities. So there's been a lot of conversations about, particularly now, about vaccine. 12 months ago, it was all about PPE and medical devices, but relatively little has been talked about about the procurement of those emergency health facilities. So the cost members, particularly say in Honduras, Uganda, they were able to pivot and start monitoring those emergency health facilities. In Honduras, they trained journalists to look at the data to see what was going on and identify some discrepancies in terms of that emergency procurement. So really, we feel it's been almost one of those, the unheard of story, I think, amongst procurement in COVID, where there's, amongst, I think, the open government, open contractor community, there's been a lot written. But I think more, we feel there's another story there around health infrastructure. We're really trying to encourage our members to look at those hospitals, those facilities, to really understand how money was invested there. Was it invested wisely? Or was some of the issues we've looked into the PPE and our vaccine, and now were they apparent in health infrastructure? But then looking longer term with COVID, more generally, construction sites were often closed, less investment was going in. So there was obviously an impact there. But in the longer term, many countries will use infrastructure to stimulate their economies. We know South Africa's looking at this, the UK, many economies. Joe Biden's looking at $2 trillion stimulus package in infrastructure investment in the next few weeks, which is staggering sums of money. And with the climate crisis, the issues around social inclusion, that Build Back Better message is very much an infrastructure kind of message. So cost will in some ways will never be more relevant. I think all of us in the TAI kind of community are very worried about how emergency procurement's been used, the lack of the opaqueness, the lack of participation, the lack of transparency in the last 12 months. And obviously, we've got to make sure that doesn't continue. It doesn't become the norm. And given the infrastructure, I think we believe in the next, certainly by end of this year, beginning of next year, in terms of building back better, that huge investment that's going to happen, there's a risk of the same kind of need to move things fast to get jobs into the sector, because the construction workers is often a way of getting the economy moving, getting people employed. We've got to ensure that things are done correctly, that if emergency systems are used, they're open, contracts are published, data's published in terms of those decisions. And that we learn from what's happened in the last 12 months and make sure that doesn't happen again, and that the citizens have access to the information that ensures those dollars, pounds, euros, etc. are invested wisely.
Well, John, looking at the sector in general, do you think that corruption is underreported in the construction sector?
It's a very interesting question, and I was thinking about this earlier this afternoon. Broadly, yes, and I was kind of thinking why that is. There's obviously been many scandals globally within individual countries. We only have to think about the Odebrecht scandal in Latin America, how really a whole political elite system was corrupted across the region. But in some ways, I think it is underreported compared to, say, other sectors. There seems to be less demand globally for action around infrastructure. I think locally it's different. I think locally you do get different dynamics around infrastructure. But I think one of the things we find is that civil society and journalists particularly are unsure how to report on infrastructure. They're unsure how to write about it. They're also wary of the political economy dynamics around infrastructure, how infrastructure is used for political campaign financing. So in COST, we very much, our members and multi-stakeholder groups work with journalists and civil society organizations to build their capacity to understand why infrastructure transparency is so important. But then get them to understand what the issues are, what the data is telling them, and then how to mine into that, how to deep dive into that and carry out an investigation, report on it. There's been a lot of shared lessons between Uganda, Malawi, Honduras, Ukraine about how we can incentivize journalists to report on those issues, make them feel comfortable. So we've had awards for investigative journalism to really report those stories. Pardon me. Then the final thing on this topic globally is that there's two things really. Is the estimates of corruption vary enormously between 10, 30, 50%. And that's there's a reason for that, is actually determining what's mismanagement, what's inefficiency and what's corruption is very difficult. So one person's mismanagement could be another person's corruption, because what you're looking at, the information is hard. It can be easily things like poor quality of infrastructure, changing the 5 centimeters of asphalt to 3 centimeters of asphalt. Who's checking that? How does that, it's quite, those kind of areas are very difficult for lay people to report on, observe and see. So it is underreported, but there is a challenge in reporting on it. And COST is trying to overcome those challenges and build capacity to really highlight what may or may not be corruption within the sector.
I hope it comes to fruition, and people get to learn more about it and know how to report more about about transparency in the corruption sector. So now to you, John, what's your favorite thing about your work? What do you love about working on this issue?
I think, I mean, it is, and I'm sure we all find this. It's working with our colleagues on the ground the colleagues in the countries, talking to them about the challenges they face. You know, some of them work under very difficult conditions. You know, at risk, given the topic. And they're quite, you know, they are inspiring. And they've really, in the last few years, of course, they've driven the innovation. They've, particularly on the social accountability side, I think they've really identified what will work in their context, what is politically, not just politically, social economy type things, but culturally, what is going to work. Cultures are different everywhere, you know, all throughout the world. And they've used the mechanisms that will work in those countries, whether it's high tech, low tech. And that is inspirational. I mean, when you go to these countries and you learn so much. So that's the most inspiring thing, and I've missed it the last 12 months. You know, not to be able to meet our colleagues in person and learn on the ground. You don't learn it from being at home in West London in quite the same way.
But let's say you were to retire tomorrow, what will you miss most? Apart from your colleagues, what will you miss most about this work?
What I miss if I was to retire tomorrow? Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it is that, I mean, the people definitely, I'm really learning so much about different countries, different, how things work, what can be achieved, what can't be achieved, and those kind of almost thinking through what we can achieve in a certain context, whether it's, you know, a colleague, you know, whether it's Kampala or Tegucigalpa or, you know, Kiev or wherever it's been. It's been really it's just been fascinating to really say, okay, what can we achieve here? What can we do here? And how can we make it work?
Good. So John, so this is a fun question, nothing too serious. So if you're a ruler of your own country, what would be the first law you will introduce?
Yeah, this is the question yeah, the hardest question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I mean, professionally, I think definitely opening up infrastructure. I don't know personally. I don't know, to be honest. It's not something I kind of, yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely not made for a career in politics.
That's a good one also, opening up infrastructure. It's a good law, whether personal or professional. Yeah, so on that note, we round up our interview. Thank you so much, John, for joining us today and for sharing your experience and knowledge around construction transparency. I'm sure people listening have also gained a thing or two about the work you do at first and what construction transparency entails and why people should care about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pussy. I mean, it's a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome.